Okay, hello and welcome. Welcome to this author talk presented by the Fulton County Library System. I'm Kelly Cornwell. I'm a librarian with special collections at the Central Library, and we are here today talking with Libby Copeland about her new book. Libby is an award-winning journalist and author, and she writes from New York about culture, science, and human behavior. Her book is called The Lost Family, and it explores the rapidly evolving phenomenon of at-home DNA testing. And it talks about the implications for how we think about family, think about ourselves, and the ramification of this testing for our American culture. Welcome, Libby. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be with you, Kelly.
I was really thrilled with your book. I really enjoyed reading it, and it really helped me out because every time I teach a genealogy class, my number one question is, should I get my DNA tested? So now I have something better to say than, oh no. But tell me, how did you end up writing this book, and what made you interested in this topic?
Yeah, sure. So I've been a journalist for a little over 20 years, and the stories that I'm always drawn to are the tales of, ordinary people who find themselves in unusual and extraordinary situations, and particularly the intimate stories of kind of the push-pull of what makes us who we are, the decisions we make. And so a few years ago, I became interested in how technology is shaping how we behave, and particularly how home DNA testing, which is a big business and billed as a form of recreation and entertainment, actually can have really profound consequences and really reshape people's lives in surprising ways, in ways that they're not expecting. So, basically, a lot of people test with a sense of casual curiosity. They test because a DNA test kit is on sale from a particular company, and they want to take advantage of the sale. They're looking to find out more about that ethnicity estimate, which is that pie chart that you get that tells you, where your people are from. And some people discover that what they understood about themselves or about their family histories is actually not the truth as far as biology goes. They might discover, for instance, that they're not genetically related to the man they consider dad. They might discover that they have an older half sibling they didn't know existed, that dad or mom helped conceive years ago and that information wasn't relayed to them. They might discover that they're donor conceived, or even they're adopted, particularly if they're older. These facts about their origins might harken back to a time when such things were stigmatized. And so parents didn't necessarily tell children the truth about their origins. And people are finding out now, and they're sometimes finding out in ways that are sort of sudden and disruptive. And then they're going to their parents and saying, hey, mom, can we talk about something that I just found out when I spit into a tube? But, more than sort of the immediate disruption, this is actually in many ways allowing many Americans to rethink their own personal narratives, their own identities, their understandings of ethnicity, their understandings of family. And so I wanted to kind of explore that. And I wrote an article for the Washington Post 3 years ago that looked at some of these themes of, unexpected results from DNA testing. And it was the response to that article that kind of blew me away. I got hundreds of emails from people saying, let me tell you about what happened to me. Like, I tested 5 years ago. I tested 2 years ago. I'm still grappling with this. Like, I'm so glad I tested. Here's what happened. Or, I feel rejected, but I'm still glad that I know, but let me tell you about it. And I could see that it was playing out in all sorts of different ways. It had psychological ramifications, and it had sociological ones, right? In terms of how we think about the nuclear family unit. So I went back and I wanted to tell some of the stories of people who reached out to me, other people that I found in my research, and look also at the science and the business of the industry. And so that's sort of how the book came to be.
Yeah, so, and you've framed the book with this really intriguing story of Alice. And when she spit into a tube and the results that she got were not what she was expecting. So this is like looking into this DNA testing through Alice. And she became a seeker and wanting to know all the answers to this. So can you talk a little bit about Alice?
Yeah, Alice is such a great character, such a great true story. I knew that, science journalism can be a little dry. And I didn't want people to feel put off by that or like they needed a PhD in genetics. I know I don't have one. And so I wanted I wanted for people to feel this was really accessible and very personal. And so what I wanted for the central narrative of the book was a story that would kind of grab you by the heels and not let you go, like, a page turner. And I found this story in Alice. Alice is a woman in her 70s who lives in Washington State. She's an extremely intelligent person with a very analytical mind. She's also funny. And she's someone you kind of want to spend time with because she has this lovely, dry sense of humor and self-deprecating attitude. And she was a longtime family history researcher by the time she sped into a tube in 2012. 2012 was 8 years ago, but it was also a long time ago in the context of this industry, which has been around now for 20 years. But 2012 was a kind of an important moment because it's the time when Ancestry, which is a big DNA testing company now, first unveiled its DNA test, its autosomal DNA test. And autosomal DNA looks at your DNA that is inherited from both parents, and it can tell you about your genetic relatives on both sides of your family. So it can show a first cousin. If a first cousin has also tested it in the same company, they'll show up as a first cousin in the database. And it gives you as well that pie chart that tells you where your ancestors came from, anywhere from, say, 500 to 1,000 years ago. So if you are an American mutt like me, you can expect a pie chart that has many little slices of different colors kind of taken out of it, right? But Alice was expecting a pie chart that was all one color, pretty much. And that's because she understood that both of her parents were primarily Irish, of Irish genetic ancestry. And so she is not looking with a sense of like, what am I? She's knowing what she is and going into it and hoping that the DNA can help her around what genealogists like to call brick walls. So there are sometimes cases, as you know, because you work, in this world, where the paper records just don't yield any more answers because they don't exist, maybe, right? Or they're illegible. You can't get back before 1810. Well, DNA takes you back. It does that both by allowing you to see where your ancestors come from and linking you up with modern day cousins. And if you can sort of share your information with them and they share with you and put your heads together on some family trees, you can also often figure out where you fit together and then figure out your common ancestors. And that's incredibly helpful for genealogical research. So Alice heads into this thinking she knows what she's going to find, but she's just going to get more information. It's going to help her research back further, back into Ireland. And what she finds is that instead of this pie chart that's basically all one color, it's actually split down the middle. It is half Irish and British Isles like she expects. The other half is Ashkenazi Jewish genetic ancestry. And Ashkenazi Jews are Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. They have a unique genetic signature that looks different from the genetic signature of someone who is Irish. And so she's at first kind of flabbergasted because this doesn't make sense given what she knows. And she assumes that Ancestry has simply messed up. They haven't, perfected their algorithm. Some people assume that maybe their vial's been mixed up with someone else's vial of spit. It's almost never the case. But Alice, like many people, assumes that she knows her family history and it's the company that's messed up. And it turns out that, of course, it's she and her family that have gotten its history so wrong. And she embarks on this, unbelievable sort of twisting, surprising 2.5-year genetic mystery, where she works basically every day. She's retired. It becomes her full-time job to unravel the genetic strands and the genealogical research to understand how her family got its history so wrong. So along the way, she's able to dismiss the most common explanations that would typically be the explanation for a situation like hers.
Right,
So,
they have a lot of theories.
There are a lot of theories. So, and that allows me to sort of walk readers through what does a DNA surprise look like. So the most common explanation for Alice's situation would be that she's the product of an NPE. And an NPE means non-paternity event or not parent expected. Sometimes it's called MPE for misattributed parentage experience. And the kind of plethora of acronyms should tell you something, which is that this is not an uncommon experience. It's probably in the low single digits if you look across the culture, but there's so many people testing now, that's a lot of people, right? So Alice is, of course, first thinking that maybe her father is not genetically her father, but she's able to eliminate that theory through her research. She's also able to eliminate the possibilities that she's donor conceived, that she's adopted, or that her family had hidden genetic ancestry, like perhaps they were Irish Jews, right, who kind of forgot that they were Jewish somehow through an intergenerational process of forgetting. And as she eliminates a theory, it allows me to show the readers what it looks like when it does turn out to be, a late discovery adoption. I talk about a woman who discovers in her early 50s that she's in fact adopted. She discovers this through spitting into a vial. I tell the story of a man who discovers he has significant sub-Saharan African ancestry. His mother chose not to tell him. She told him instead that he was Sicilian, encouraging him and the family to pass as white because she had experienced such profound discrimination as a biracial child that she felt she wanted to protect him from that knowledge. And so Alice takes these twists and turns and ultimately is able to figure out the answer to her mystery, but it takes her a very long time, and it turns out that the explanation goes back 100 years. And so one of the pleasures of the book was going back and doing the historical research into the setting, and the setting exactly a century before that had allowed for this kind of profound case of mistaken identity to take place that then had implications for generations of people. So I'll stop there, but I'll just say one more thing about Alice, which is that she's just so much fun to spend time with, right? And I was able to go out to Washington State and kind of see how she built a database of her own DNA and the DNA of all 7 of her. She has 6 siblings. There's 7 Collins children. So there's her plus 6 others. And she built basically databases of her DNA, her siblings' DNA, and all of their Jewish cousins in an attempt to unravel this mystery. It was an absolutely massive and masterful effort. And it's kind of fascinating to see what she did.
Yes. And I love the ways that she's just sort of interwoven through the book. So as you explore the history of DNA at home testing and talk about the different implications of it, we're still moving through Alice's story. And as she explores each one of her theories, starting with like one of the most obvious ones, we hear these other stories of people who that theory was correct for them and how they processed it and, the outcome for them. And I was really pulling for Alice's theory that it actually was. And then when it was, I was like, oh no. So yeah, it was really great. And of course, the Italian, the man who thought he was Italian changed his name. And there's just a lot of really sad stories. And it was very interesting to see the way that they processed it, because one of the keys to Alice's discovery was someone who spit into a tube, got back weird results, and was like, Mom, look at this, probably wrong, right? And did not become a seeker. They sort of just dismissed it, but ended up being the key to Alice's mystery.
Yeah, I know. And you see how kind of dogged you would have had to have been, though, just 8 years ago, in caring about surprising results and then digging, right? And there's a massive contrast between then and now. because that was a time when the databases were really, really small, right? I think it wasn't even until 2013 that if you added all the databases together, you would have had 1 million DNA test kits sold and taken, right? 1 million. Today, there are more than 35 million DNA test kits that have been taken, the majority of them in the US, and that's spread across 4 major databases. It's totally different now because if you test, you will very quickly find a first cousin, a half sibling, and that means that you're not going to take, it's not going to take you a lot of time to unravel a question you might have about your genealogy, or maybe a surprise about your family that you weren't expecting. It's going to come right to you, which can be good and bad. It means that you get that immediate knowledge. It also sometimes means you don't have the time to kind of process something that maybe you weren't expecting.
Right. Yeah. When you talked about the 35 million tests, I mean, when you mentioned this in your book, you talk about it as sort of like a tipping point in America. So can you talk a little bit about that, like the implications of all of these tests out there and what they're being used for?
Yeah, so because so many people have tested and are in the databases, and because so many of those people are American, there's probably somewhere around close to 8% of the US population that's represented in these databases. But of course, we share genetic material with one another if we are kin, which means that even if I haven't tested, your decision to test, if you're my second cousin, for instance, has implications for me. In other words, it's increasingly not a choice that we have to opt out of this technology, to engage or not engage with this technology, because enough people are opted in that if there's a genetic secret in a family, it's going to come out, whether or not the person in question, the person about whom there's a surprise for their genetic origins, whether or not they test, potentially. It could be that somebody else tests and the news kind of unravels that way. And so what that means is that we are in this really unique moment, a moment of genetic reckoning, right? Where we're looking at the past and we're realizing, gosh, all these ways of coming into the world 60, 70 years ago were considered taboo. Maybe a parent wouldn't tell their child that they were donor conceived. Maybe because there was shame around infertility. Maybe because the doctor said, or the psychologist said, it's better for the bonding between father and child if neither one of them knows. And in fact, they would get around knowing sometimes by mixing the sperm of the intended father with the donor, so that the parents never truly knew who the genetic father was. And that was considered to be, by some psychologists, the way to go. So, you have this now situation where, our present culture, which I think of as a kind of a culture of transparency and authenticity, where people want to write their own stories on blogs and tell them in memoirs and on podcasts, is kind of colliding with a radically different world, right? A culture from 60, 70 years ago that is so different, it's like a foreign country. And people are testing, and they're expecting news that comes with a kind of a emotional and psychological remove. They're thinking, I'm going to find out more about my grandfather, or I recall hearing that we might have some Native American ancestry. Let me see if that's true. And they're doing that. And then sometimes they're getting something so unexpected, right? Like, why is it saying I have an older half sister? I don't have an older half sister, or not that it would tell the person's age necessarily, but if you start corresponding with them, that would come out. Or why I know my dad's in this company's database, but he's not matching to me. And that's like so weird. So it's an interesting time, I guess, to be in. And I think, with a few million people in the databases, you could reasonably say, I'm not going to engage with this because I don't know what it's going to tell me about my family, or I have privacy concerns, or what have you. With 35 million people in the database, it's as if we're all sort of, engaged with this technology, whether or not we spent $99 and spit into a vial.
Right, because even if you never tested, when day your little email, there's but.
Right.
Yeah, so yeah, you don't even have to be involved or want to be involved. And I really was interested in people who got these results that they didn't expect, and then proceeded to seek out and try and find out what happened, and then seek connections with people that they didn't realize they were related to, and that the responses varied widely there. And that was a really interesting part of your book, where people reached out, and then like there was a lot of different responses.
Yeah.
Because this tipping point we're in America.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I wanted to explore is, number one, what is the impulse to know more? And that impulse to know more or to meet your genetic kin really varied depending on where you were in the context of the kind of, say, triad of a family secret. So if you were the person about whom the information was very germane, right, because it told you something surprising about your genetic origins, that's a different situation than perhaps the mother of that child, or who perhaps has maintained a secret about the child's true genetic father, or that man on the other side, who is the genetic father of that child and may or may not know that he conceived that child. He may know and has been, not engaging with that knowledge for decades. He may not know and may be very uncomfortable with the news or very happy with the news. So what I tried to do was sort of tell, when possible, a kind of a 360, right? Who are the seekers? And the seekers are people who, are trying to understand themselves through better understanding of the past. And I include in that also just genealogists who are not discovering surprises, but are really feeling like the context for their lives is enhanced and changed by understanding what came before and how they came to be. And it also includes those people who discover like a mystery on their hands, like Alice, or a surprise, and they have to kind of reconcile with it. So who are the seekers, and what drives them to often want to know more about their genetic origins? And then, how do you go about the process of writing a letter to your genetic father? And I get into that quite a bit because there's a whole lot of emotion and context that varies from person to person about how you even construct that, right? And if you're donor conceived and you're discovering you have 10 siblings through the same donor father, you might construct that letter in a democratic process. And I heard stories about people sending the draft around to every sibling to make sure it represented every person's point of view before they sent it off. An incredibly lengthy and emotionally fraught exercise. And then how does the man on the other side respond to that? How does the mother respond to that when she's confronted with this question of, hey, mom, you never told me this? How do the children of the genetic father, for instance, in this situation respond? Do they feel threatened? Are they welcoming? It really goes all sorts of different ways. I learned that when I got my first batch of several hundred emails from people after I'd written that Washington Post story. And the stories were so variable. Sometimes they were really heartwarming, and sometimes they were heart-rending because people really wanted connection. Sometimes they really wanted to be kind of embraced, and they experienced rejection instead.
Yes, it can be. And the donor, you talk about a gentleman who in college thought it was a great way to make money was to donate sperm. And I think he's up to like 16 children who have contacted him so far, because he is fairly welcoming.
He actually did it when he was newly married. He was newly married and I think he had a daughter or a daughter on the way, and his wife suggested that he donate his sperm because they were barely making ends meet, and it was just going to augment their income. And he was the 1970s. I interviewed him about, sort of how he imagined it then, and then sort of like how he envisions it, or how it's played out for him now. This is a guy who never could have imagined the rise of DNA testing when he was donating his sperm to fertility banks. And honestly, who could have foreseen this in the 1970s? And so, the years go by and he has two daughters that he raises. And the daughters at some point come to him and they say that they have decided to buy him a DNA kit for the holidays. And he doesn't even realize what it's going to, like the information that it's going to give him. Which is interesting because most people, there's a lot of ads for DNA testing kits. If you see the major companies' ads, often the focus is on these, the pie chart, the ethnicity estimate. And some people only assume they assume that's all the information they're getting. And if you don't look closer, you might not realize you're going to get your genetic relatives. And this man only assumes that he's getting an ethnicity estimate pie chart. He doesn't even know that he's going to be matched to relatives. So he says, okay, I'll do this. And he spits into a tube and he sends it off. And then all of a sudden his genetic children start popping up as related to him. And some of them have been searching for him and are, happy to be able to reach out to him and connect with him. And he is like, what do I do now? Right. And he basically goes to the daughters that he raised and he says to them, you're the next generation. You're going to have to live with whatever decision we make as a family for much longer than me. So what do you want to do? Which I think is a really lovely and compassionate approach, right? He's kind of allowing them to decide how they want to define family. And they decide they're open. They want to know some of these siblings. And so he says, okay. And at this point, I think he has, so in total, 24 genetic children. The last time I talked to him, 2 of them are the ones he raised, 22 are his donor kids. And with each person, it's a navigation of what kind of relationship to have, what kind of relationship they want. It may vary for a person who is conceived in this way. It may depend on their relationship with their father that they have, what kind of relationship they want with their biological father. One of his genetic children, who I spent a lot of time talking to, talked a lot about the language that she used, how she arrived at the language for him, how they negotiated it, what to call him, because she didn't want to call him dad. She already had a dad. So the language that they settled on, which was Pops, had a familiarity without being necessarily overly fatherly, I think. And then how she refers then to her siblings as well. And how she feels about not having been able to know them up till now. A lot of people express a sense of bittersweetness when they discover previously unknown genetic kin. The sweetness comes from knowing and being able to forge these relationships when wanted, which a lot of the stories I told, that people did want relationships. The bitterness or the sense of loss comes from having lost all those years of connection and feeling like you won't be able to get those back.
Yes. One thing that we talk about and that I like to talk about is the difference between your family history and your family narrative or your family stories, because every family has stories. And of course, that's the thing that we love as people is the story. But like, even when I started looking into my own genealogy, I was like, timeline seems a little off there, from what I've heard, being told. So when these two things collide, because there are vast differences or even, minute differences, talk about the impacts of that, the difference between your family history and the family narrative.
Yeah. I mean, I think, we are storytellers and we hinge our identities on these stories that we tell. And sometimes we simplify them, maybe without even meaning to. I know, like, I am certainly selective in my memory about my childhood, for instance, right? I remember certain things and not others. And who knows why my brain selects those particular things and then stitches them into a narrative that I tell. And somebody else observing it with like a documentary camera might say, oh oh no, you've got a completely skewed read on what happened. But this is how we kind of get through and make sense of our lives, and tell our stories and forge our identities. So for the person who is discovering a surprise about themselves, right, a surprise about how they were made, how they came into the world, it is often, for every person that I interviewed, and I corresponded with or interviewed over 400 people for this book, it is often a trauma to discover that what you thought about yourself is not quite right, or very much not right. And I think that has to do with the fact that it's very difficult to tell your story when your once upon a time is totally different than you expected. It's not as if that changes and everything else stays the same. It's more that once your beginning changes, everything else changes in a kind of a cascade effect. So you look back at childhood memories and they're now thrown into a different light. Things that maybe were questions on a subconscious level are suddenly answered. People told me stories about remembering things they hadn't thought about in years. And suddenly, almost like annotating their lives, like if you were to put an asterisk next to every experience and then reprocess it in light of this new information, it throws everything into a kind of a different light. And for the people on the other side, I'll take, for example, say a half sibling. Let's say you're the child of a woman who, as I tell in the book, had a child before you were born, and gave that child up for adoption. Perhaps she placed that baby at 4 days old into a basket and dropped that basket at a pastor's door and walked some blocks away and called from a phone booth and said, "There's a baby on your doorstep," which is a story that I tell in the book. So all of a sudden you are contacted by this baby that you never knew existed, and your mother is no longer alive. And this baby, who is now all grown up and in her 50s, is telling you that she exists, that your mother did this. Whatever narrative you have about your mother and whether your relationship was awesome or complicated, it is so jarring to that narrative of that relationship, and even perhaps jarring to your idea about her capacity for maternal love, that your response may be, "I don't believe this. I don't believe the science. I don't believe that the DNA testing companies know what they're doing," which is the response that the daughters in the story of a particular account that I give of a woman named Jackie, that's the response that they have. And they're matching to her in the database. But they just say, I think it's in this case 23andMe. 23andMe, surely you've messed up. We don't believe it. It is so incredibly threatening. So, we have these narratives, and there's a reason that they are, they're often sacred to us. And I don't think we're wrong to be selective necessarily. I think that's sort of how we function and how our brains work. But when those narratives collide with a different genetic reality, it can be really confusing and upsetting. And it's hard to know, how much should this biological reality get to tell us about who we are, get to impact the experiences we know we had, and get to alter our memories of people that we loved.
Yes. It's like, when I started working in genealogy, no one ever told me that, occasionally my patrons will cry, at the computer. So yeah, it can be really jarring. Wow. And, glorious or not.
Right.
One thing I would like to talk about is the African-American community and at-home DNA testing, because the history, slavery, doing genealogy is really difficult. So can you talk a little bit about DNA testing in the African-American community?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the issues with doing genealogical research is this reliance on records that sometimes don't exist, either because something happened to them or because they were never created in the first place. And this is where, genealogists hit their brick walls and get very frustrated. And records tend to go hand in hand with power. So, but by that I mean, if you are a literate community, you're more likely to have records. If you have had access to pen and paper, you're more likely to have records. If your institutions were preserved and not burned down, if your people were not, separated and sent to live far, far away from one another, you're more likely to have this continuity of records. And so, particularly for people who have been, who've had their power taken away, who've been disenfranchised, it can be incredibly difficult to do genealogical research. And so it's like the kind of losses of history are compounded by the loss of records, right? It's incredibly frustrating. So if you are African American and you descend from people who were enslaved, if you try to research back before 1870, you're going to hit a brick wall, because the federal census wasn't recording names of slaves. It was recording them as a mark on a page, but it wasn't listing their names.
Right, so right. I've seen things where it's like 3 male, 2 boys, 4 women, and that's all you get.
Right, exactly.
Records. Exactly.
Which is not to say there are other records that people can sometimes get lucky and find. But, this can be a real stumbling block for people. And so DNA testing has allowed, some people to kind of get around that. And I tell a couple of stories in the book of African-American genealogists and sort of what they're able to accomplish. And one in particular is a man who is able to use those database cousins that he finds, his genetic cousins, combined with his ethnicity estimates to get pretty granular about multiple branches along his family. And in one case, he's able to find a present-day cousin who lives in Africa. So somebody who lives in Africa, but donated donated, or I should say pay for kit, I'm not sure which, his DNA to the company, and matches him as a cousin, a distant cousin, because their relationship goes back to before this genealogist's ancestors came over as slaves. And then because of that relationship, because he can connect with this man and they can talk, he discovers the precise community of people that he came from. So he's able to get far more granular than, West Africa, than a huge massive region, or even a present day country designation, and down to a specific community of people, which once he has that name, and I think the people were the Fulani people, he's then able to look them up, and he can do historical research on, who they would have been back then, their customs, their language, and he can get access to something that otherwise would have been absolutely impossible.
Yeah, so in some ways, it's super great. And this is like the 20th anniversary of at-home DNA testing. So how Ancestry started everything by putting out the first at-home DNA test. So can you talk a little bit about the history of the industry and how it got started and how we so rapidly got where we are in 20 years?
Sure. So Ancestry actually didn't put out the first test. They came along in 2012. But the very first DNA testing company for Ancestry in the US was a company called Family Tree DNA. It's still around, and it's one of the major 4 databases. So just a little kind of rundown, the 4 major companies that offer DNA testing for ancestry purposes are Ancestry, which has the biggest database, 23andMe, which has the next biggest, MyHeritage, which has the 3rd biggest, and Family Tree DNA, which is the oldest and smallest. But these are all databases that are in the millions of people. And so Family Tree DNA was started because it was started by a genealogist who was confronted with a brick wall in his own research and was sort of stymied by it and said to himself, how can I figure this out? Maybe I could do a DNA test, but that didn't exist at the time. And so he basically got to know a scientist in the process of asking the guy if he could get a DNA test, and the guy saying no. He got to know this guy who was doing DNA research at the time, looking at Y DNA with them. So the male, the Y chromosome that males have that they inherit from their fathers. And he started a business of testing Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA, which every person inherits from their mother up the matrilineal line. And so these kinds of DNA, compared to what we have now, which is autosomal, were different in terms of what they could tell you. They're generally giving you your ancient migration routes. So they're going much, much further back. They're not telling you about, for the most part, present day living relatives. If they match you to someone in a database, you can't tell usually how closely related you are. So they're not as helpful for the kinds of research most people want to do, but there were certainly hobbyists who were into testing with family tree DNA back in the early days, but not that many from the founder's descriptions. I flew down to Texas and interviewed the founder, Bennett Greenspan, and he told me about going to genealogical conferences and trying to persuade people to buy his product, and it not being very easy. And he would shake people's hands, and he would walk backwards toward his booth and talk and talk and talk, so they wouldn't let go of his hand, because he figured if he could get them close to his booth, maybe he could make a sale, right? And because the results were sort of crude compared to what autosomal DNA can tell you, and because these tests were very expensive, you didn't really see this taking off in a major league way, certainly not in a mainstream way. But autosomal comes on the scene. 23andMe debuts it, Family Tree and Me adds it, and then in 2012, Ancestry offers its own autosomal DNA test. And through the last, say, 2016, 2017, you see Ancestry putting a lot of money towards advertising. So both years they spent $100 million in advertising. And probably people are most familiar with their ads. They're probably very familiar with the ad, about that DNA testing is going to tell you who you are. There's a famous ad about a guy named Kyle who says, I thought I was one thing, I turned out to be another. So I traded in my lederhosen for a kilt, and he's wearing lederhosen, and then you see him in a kilt, and there's this idea that you're going to make a kind of a cool discovery that's going to allow you access to more of the world, basically. So what happens is that DNA testing goes from being a kind of a niche item, something that is really just for serious family historians, to a mainstream consumer item, something that you buy as a gift for someone on Thanksgiving because, they already, you can't think of what else to get them. So you get them this, right? And with that rise to a casual consumer product, you get a lot more people in the databases, a lot more people matching, and a lot more questions about identity, almost existential questions, from people who maybe weren't expecting to engage in such a profound process, but now here they are.
Yes. And but DNA isn't just for family history anymore, is it? Because I just watched a documentary where it was a big part of solving a murder mystery of the Golden State Killer. So you talk a little bit in your book about this. There's a chapter on using DNA this way, and you revisit it a couple times. So can you talk a little bit about this, using DNA to solve cold cases?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm curious if you remember the name of the documentary, because if I haven't seen it, I want to watch it. Do you recall?
It's about the Golden State
Killer.
Killer?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I will have to look it up.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. So about 2 years ago, there was a breakthrough in how basically cold cases are solved, and it involved genetic information that had been gathered for genealogical purposes. So basically, about 9 or 10 years ago, people who are adopted and search angels and genetic genealogists who work with people who are adopted to find their birth parents, because they often can't, because state laws may block them from access to their original birth certificates. They figured out that you could find the identity of somebody, even if they weren't in the database, if you were genetically related to them, by matching yourself to, say, a third cousin, and then doing genealogical research backward and then bringing it back forward. Ideally multiple, if you're working with, say, third or fourth cousins, which is very difficult, ideally you would have a few of them. And this is a process that can take months or years, but has been done. And so people were working with, these databases, which, as I said, were relatively small at the time, and they were putting together this information. They were allowing adopted people to figure out the identities of their birth fathers and their birth mothers. So, fast forward several years to 2018, and there was a cold case that had taken place. It was sort of, I guess, continually warm in California, and that was the case of the Golden State Killer. It had never been solved, but it had also never been given up on. And they had tried to use DNA to solve it, and they had tried that by using a law enforcement database called CODIS. But the kind of DNA that's in CODIS is different from the kind of DNA that is used for genealogical research, and it had never produced a hit, which would have allowed them to know who this criminal was who was committing these murders and rapes. So this is a man who is believed to have, and has now been convicted of, 13 homicides, and he's believed to have committed over 50 rapes. And he was at large primarily in the 70s, and I think in the 80s. And his name was Joseph James D'Angelo, we now know. So what eventually happened was that one of these search angels who works with adopted people was contacted by an investigator out in California who wanted to see if they could use the same techniques that she had used with adoptees to find the identity of this man who had left his DNA at the scene and had never been caught. And in fact, they were able to do it. And they were able to do it not by getting into Ancestry or 23andMe or MyHeritage or one of these major databases, but they were able to do it because there's a site called GEDmatch, which was like a third-party place where you could upload your genetic information from one of the major DNA testing companies, and you could do sort of fancy things to it. You use tools to analyze it, compare it to other people's samples that maybe had been taken from other companies, and so they couldn't talk to each other. So GEDmatch was a place for DNA information that had been gathered at different companies to be compared. And basically, Barbara Ray Venter, who was the genetic genealogist that the investigator reached out to, she was able to do what she had been doing for adoptees for years, and that was to find the identity of a guy who at the time had never been a suspect, had never been a person of interest. And once they were able to figure out his identity, even though he had never his DNA was not in GEDmatch, but again, through these cousins, you can find someone's identity. And through the crime scene DNA, they were able to figure it out. Once they were able to do that, they were able to confirm that he was indeed a suspect by matching some DNA he had left in a public place. So typically that's like a man might blow into a tissue or use a straw, discard it in a wastebasket in a public place. Police can take that, they can confirm the match, and then they can make an arrest. And that's what they did with this man. And he was just convicted 2 years later, this past summer. So this has led to a kind of a revolution in cold cases. Barbara Ray Venter says that it's been used by her estimate in over 200 cold cases. And some of them go back to the 50s, some of them go back even further. And there's been somewhat of a privacy debate around whether this is the right thing. But I don't know that I see signs of it stopping. It seems to be, the tool of last resort for particularly heinous crimes that have been lingering forever, for which, there is DNA for them, but there's literally no other way to solve them, or they've thrown everything at the wall and nothing has stuck.
Yes, yes. The documentary, I think it's an HBO and it's called I'll Be Gone in the
Yes,
Dark.
I'll Be Gone in the Dark. Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yeah,
Michelle McNamara. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So it's kind of sad. So as one of the last questions I have is like where, so all of these people, these millions of people have tested. So is testing slowing down? What happens to these companies when we're all tested?
Yeah,
They
sure.
just storage facilities?
Right. So I think, these companies want to continue to grow their databases. And they also are expanding toward health related testing. So it seems like the first wave of interest in these products has been driven by people with an interest in ancestry. And so you see, just that is sort of with the compelling ads, that is why, people sign up. And the first probably 35 million people, the vast majority of them were interested in that. And the last year or so, there's been somewhat of a slowdown. That may be in part because of privacy concerns. It also may be because, and I talk in the book at great length about privacy concerns. I won't get into them here, but I think it's an important topic. But it also may be, and this is probably the greater explanation, is that like the pool of people who are willing to spend, say, $99 to find out about their ancestry and their relatives may be, the pool that's been hit, right? And so they've kind of, vacuumed up all the early adopters. And so the companies have been pivoting towards health related testing. So this might be testing to tell you about whether you're at increased risk of breast cancer, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, allergies, rosacea, and the interest in that from the company's point of view is that they can, for instance, with 23andMe, they can work on understanding diseases better. They may be able to develop pharmaceutical drugs, which they can sell, and they can kind of speed up the process of doing that because they have such a large pool of people. And so I do think that you're going to see more of that if there's interest from people, and if people talk to their physician says, yes, this is a helpful thing to do. You're going to see somewhat more of perhaps of a coming together between the medical establishment and an industry that was billed as recreational DNA testing, but is looking less and less recreational and potentially more and more like personalized medicine.
Yes. Okay, so last question. What advice do you have for people who are thinking about doing a at-home DNA test?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know that, when you test, you'll get a little cautionary advisory message that's going to say, you may discover things about your family that you weren't expecting. Or you may, discover unexpected relatives. And to know that is a caution that you may be tempted to kind of ignore, but it's something to take seriously. Although I found in my interviews with people, most people assume that it doesn't apply to them, which makes a certain amount of sense, because why would you assume that there's something really stunning and surprising in your own genetic origins or in your family, right? We assume we know that there is to know.
Yeah.
So because of the kind of limitations of those advisories, I would say the other piece of advice I give is, increasingly it's not a choice about whether we opt out or we opt in, right? And every family has its secrets for sure. And some of those are of a genetic nature and they could potentially come out as a result. And so I think it's important for the older generation, the generation of people who might be keeping secrets about the genetic origins of their offspring, to think about whether this is a moment when it's important to have a conversation with their children and tell them about this, tell them about the way they came into the world. Because from my interviews, I've found that people are, they're definitely, kind of overwhelmed by this information, but that if it comes from someone who loves them, it seems to go better than if they're spitting into a vial and getting the news from their screen. And I think, a lot of that goes to the sense of trust in your relationship with your parent, and that, that trust can be frayed when the information comes from outside of them. But if it comes from them, even if it's very, very late, it may be easier to kind of repair the bond. That that act of not telling for all those decades, as understandable as it may be, you know, there may be some damage caused, but it may be easier to repair that if it's coming directly from that older generation. So I guess the advice I would give is, you know, this may be the moment for that difficult conversation. And this is enough now of a you know, a phenomenon that there are now advocacy groups for people going through these situations. There are support groups on Facebook. There are therapists specializing in this. There are at least one genetic counselor that I know of who helps people have these conversations. And so, you know, this is the moment to think about, you know, what kind of resources are out there to maybe help me have some conversations with my kids.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Well, thank you so much, Libby. I appreciate your being here and talking about this book. I'm really thrilled that you wrote it. I encourage all of my patrons to get The Lost Family and read it, because you have got to know Alice and her story. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.